Just tell me, I'll download it and I'll upload it tonight.
Okay, just tell me when. Give me half a second. I'm going to move my head even further away. Okay, tell me when.
Well, No Dice, No Glory wants to thank everybody for showing up to the first ever HMGS Roundtable for CyberWars. Our first speaker out of the bat is Mr. Matt Caffrey, and I am going to turn it over to our host, Ian. And once again, I would like to thank everybody for showing up, and thank you so much, Matt, for being willing to do this. And I know this is going to be a great brief, so I'm going to turn it over to Ian, and thank you.
All right, guys. So over the course of this conversation, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. You'll notice that no one is able to unmute themselves. That's so that way we can keep things moving and grooving. When we get to the Q&A period, I'll open it up more to unmute if that's the way we decide to go. But for right now, be sure to put all of your questions into the group chat, and I'll be sure to communicate those to Matt. Without any further ado, go ahead and take us away, Matt.
Okay, very good. Well, first, oh, geez. Okay, how do I advance my slides? All right.
I'm pushing slides for you, Matt. I've got the screen
good.
up.
Next slide.
All right. Oh.
Okay, whoops. Okay, first I have to say this is me. This isn't anybody who pays me. Next slide. Okay, so why listen to me? I'm the author of the book on wargaming. It's been downloaded from the Naval War College over 13,000 times. That's several laps more than all the other Newport series of books downloads added together. I've been doing civilian wargaming since 1967. Yes, I did start young. I've contributed to a published design, been a military wargamer since '75, taught at the School for Advanced Air Power Studies, professor of wargaming and campaign planning at Air Command and Staff College, worked at the AFMC and also taught at the German War College, and a promoter of the relationship between commercial and military wargaming. Helped found the Connections Conference in 1993, and now there are Connections conferences around the world, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, next. Okay, so the bottom line is that the US military has long understood that both technology and both our edge and technology and output has a lot to do with civilian industry. The Navy is very worried about civilian shipbuilding and civilian shipbuilding technology. The Air Force cares about the health of Lockheed and Boeing and all the other defense contractors. We talk about the defense industrial base. That has not always been the case with wargaming, but the military is increasingly realizing that this truth applies to wargaming. Next. So when did it all begin? And wargaming really goes back to the dawn of civilization, and it did not start as a popular pursuit. The first known wargame was found in the ruins of the city of Ur, which is a title contender for the oldest city on earth. It's been found in royal palaces and burial chambers. The kings, the pharaohs, the emperors were the ones that played war games. They weren't commercial, they weren't popular. An exception and a half in Greece, they were played widely, and in Rome, the generals and the senators and the more upper crust Romans also played a war game. And there was a reason for that, that war games were seen as the school for princes. They were used to help the sons of kings and pharaohs figure out how to outmaneuver the sons of other kings and pharaohs. Next slide. Next slide. That began to change with this guy. Both Benjamin Franklin and in France, Voltaire advocated that commoners should start playing chess, that the people should rule, and if the people were to rule, they needed to be able to think about strategy and about national interest and everything else, just as princes. Now, chess is still, though, the type of abstract wargaming that was used since the time of antiquity. We started getting closer to more simulation type war games where you're not just thinking abstractly, but you're trying to get insights into specific situations. That started to change as we approach the modern era. And whenever you get a big change, there's normally two requirements. One is opportunity and the other is motive. Well, the opportunity for more simulation-like war games came from a number of advances, just to scale maps and charts, a better understanding of probability, the spread of the application of scientific method beyond physics and chemistry. So you have in 1776, Adam Smith really starting the whole field of economics by applying, hypothesis testing and all the rest. And you start seeing more science and warfare as far as the design of forts and artillery and all the rest. Next. So that's opportunity. For motive, we have the Napoleonic Wars, that Napoleon conquered most of Europe, and the crown heads of Europe wanted to defeat Napoleon. They wanted to restore their prominence. And one of the things they realized is that they needed to become better at war, that the complete explanation for Napoleon wasn't his genius, but that was a big part of it. Now, there had been a gradual evolution of chess-like games to more realism. And as you can see, as early as the 1600s, you start going beyond the type of typical chess. And it's really something of a judgment call as to when you would consider second generation war games beginning. And a very strong contender is a guy by the name of Herr Reichwitz that came up with a war game that had two different teams, limited intelligence, an umpire in the middle that was controlling what the two sides would know. Sounds very, very modern, something like we could almost do today. One reason why not everyone agrees that he invented really modern wargaming was that it was used the same way the Egyptians and the Chinese and everybody else used war games to train the princes. In fact, only one copy of Herr Reichwitz war game was ever created, and that was one that resided in the royal palace and was used for the training of princes. The first clearly modern war game, simulation war game, was created by his son, Lieutenant, later Captain Reichwitz, who took his father's game and realized that, the King of Prussia, being a wonderful person, was also rather cheap, or at least of limited means. And he wasn't going to be able to create this beautiful piece of furniture with all these ceramic tiles and pewter counters painted in regimental colors and be able to use that broadly throughout the army. So the good lieutenant rewrote his father's rules and used them so that they could be executed on any topographical map. And instead of having these beautifully painted pewter pieces, he had wooden pieces that weren't in each regiment's color, but half the pieces were white and red and the other was blue and red. So red and blue in war games come from arguably the very first modern war game. But a few still say this isn't quite all the way to modern wargaming. Can we get to the next slide? because I'll keep talking and hopefully the slides will get up. We've already lost some time and I want to have time for Q&A. So they were still used maybe like the Romans used war games, in that it was the officer corps that were playing these war games, and they were really used to develop their ability to think, not for specific plans. Next slide. The person who took wargaming to pretty close to all the applications we have today was Herman von Moltke, the elder. He was interested in wargaming throughout his career. As a lieutenant, he founded a wargaming club in Berlin. He joined a club that already existed there when he was transferred. He did use war games educationally within the War College, but he also used them to help develop plans. He would also test these war games by having live maneuvers and see if the maneuvers would take the same amount of time. And you wonder if this early checking between live and on maps was the beginning of modern maneuvers. Next slide. Now, Germany was very successful and they won a whole lot of wars they shouldn't have won. The wars of German unification, if you look at the population of the two sides, the science, the armed forces, and all the rest, Prussia and then Germany should not have been as successful or have won as fast as they did. And because of these successes, and they were also really the only big wars in that part of the 1800s, a lot of people started studying Germany. A lot of people started copying German. And in my book, I have a chart that shows the years that different nations started adopting wargaming. For our purposes, let's just look at the United States. There's a little bit of an argument as to who was first, Major Livermore or Lieutenant Totten. Livermore published first, so he usually gets the credit. And he started out by simply translating German rules, but then he went back and tried to fight Civil War battles and found out that the German rules weren't bloody enough. So he was able to reverse engineer using actual battle casualties and get an improvement. And it was very well respected throughout the Army. Lieutenant Totten was much more original. He had different levels of realism in his games. So you could start with a game that was easy, but not as realistic. And then once you managed that, you could graduate to more complex games. And so this would have a big impact later that we'll get to. In the case of the Navy, there's no dispute. McCarty Little was medically retired after the Civil War. His retirement home was near where the Navy started up their War College, and without any pay over and above what he would get if he just sat in his kitchen all day, he helped organize their library, taught a number of subjects, and really started wargaming in the United States Navy. Next slide. Now, war games continued to be played by civilians, but they were still the abstract types of war games, chess or variations on the theme of chess. And kind of like, when did the military start doing simulation wargaming, second generation wargaming? What date or what product you would attribute in the civilian side is also kind of questionable. In the 1880s, a game was invented in France that is essentially modern Stratego, which has limited intelligence and different strength units, something of a simulation. Also, H.G. Wells, and I'm sorry, typo, 1913 actually, he published a set of rules for doing war games with little lead figures. His early games, you just had a cannon on each side that shot little objects, not very much of a simulation. Don't know if that should count. After World War I, miniatures wargaming became very unpopular in England, where it had been very strong. Winston Churchill, as a boy, played those types of war games. The companies that made the miniatures survived in the 20s by doing farm animals and tractors and little dinoramas of non-military things. But late in the 30s and certainly during after World War II became much more popular, very widespread in the United Kingdom, and even spread to other parts of the English-speaking world. In 1957, there was a War Game Digest in the that published in California, even though most of the subscribers lived in England, and really started to get more and more towards a simulation. But then, one of the things that history of science and invention they talk about is, what was the first personal computer? By some criteria, you would say the Alto was the first one because personal people could own it, but it was mainly hobbyists. It doesn't look like a personal computer. The Apple I, the original Apple computer, very clearly a personal computer. And so, maybe the Brits came first, but the first undisputably commercial war game for a civilian audience came out of Avalon Hill, starting in about 58, where you could just buy a box, and the box had the map, the rules, the counters. It was on a given subject. You had all you needed to play that game through. And again, talking about links between military and civilian, Avalon Hill went from about as arguably simulation game as some of the miniatures to much more clear-cut simulation game by stealing ideas from RAND. There was a Look magazine article about RAND in the late 1950s, and the head of Avalon Hill, Charles Robert, saw the article, somehow blew up one of the pictures in the article and saw they were hexes and went, oh, that makes things a lot easier. So a intersection going from military to civilian. Next slide. There was as far as naval warfare, whoops, back one. As far as naval wargaming goes, there really isn't any dispute. The gentleman, if we can keep going backwards, the gentleman you see in this picture created the first, one of the first naval war games for anybody, military or civilian. Very popular, very much a simulation. Very early on, it was prior to the Russo-Japanese War, and it sold quite well. But as any of you who have ever been published know, particularly books, royalties tend to spike. I'm not getting any royalties because I worked on it somewhat on government time and published by the government. But most people, the rule of thumb is you get half your money your first royalty check, and half of what you're going to get that the next one, and half of what you're going to get after that the next one. So this guy wants more money, and his game only came with the data you needed for 6 ships. So he publishes a supplement about all the ships in His Majesty's Navy. Well, now you got lots of different ships, bigger ships, smaller ships, but it's British ships fighting British ships. What's the fun of that? Then he comes up with a supplement that has all the ships of the Kaiser's Navy. And it turns out political correctness is not a new concept. He gets all sorts of grief about how dare you imply we may someday fight our good friends, the Germans. They're our biggest trading partner. They're our old friends. Why are you picking on them? So Janes learned his lesson. His next rule supplement was called All the World's Warships. And so much of the British foreign exchange, all the world's aircraft, all the world's refrigerators, all the world's farm tractors, all these products from the Janes Group all started with supplements to a war game. Next slide. Now, just as I gave you a little introduction to the origins of military wargaming before I started talking about the connections. Let me give you a little walkthrough of the evolution of popular wargaming. As I said, it really started in the 50s with Charles Roberts, or undeniably started in the 50s with Charles Roberts with board wargaming. Eric Dott took over when Roberts went bankrupt and kept things going in the 60s. In the 70s, Jim Dunnigan and his crew in New York City started publishing Strategy and Tactics magazine with a war game in each issue. And this exploded the number of war games played each year, new titles coming out, and the range of titles coming out, because you could have more esoteric titles in an issue every now and then. If you're a standalone game, you needed it to be something more commercial. When we get into the 80s, very few people have home computers yet. They tend to be, you know, guys with abnormally large amounts of education and abnormally large amounts of disposable income. And a lot of the recreational software early on were war games, a much bigger part of the market share than later. In the 90s, more and more people start buying computers, so it's a much more diverse market, and the share of the market that goes to war games start to decline. Next slide. Now, what all this means is that over a half century, the number of people playing war games grew tremendously. You know, the number of people who play miniature war games are pretty steady. You know, board games go up and down, computer games change interest, but decade after decade, you've got a fair number of people playing miniatures. But overall, you have this big explosion in print war games, especially in the 70s. And then when you get into the 80s and 90s, you have recreational software passing by Hollywood a couple of years after the turn of the century. Of course, as recreational software gets bigger and bigger, the wargaming slice gets smaller and smaller. But as a very good friend of mine pointed out, a small slice of a really, really big pie is still a lot. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk about some of the early connections between commercial wargaming and the military. Very, very early on, Charles Roberts tries to sell a game called Game Train. And the military guys are interested in it, but the civil servants that actually have to execute the contract aren't, so it doesn't go anywhere. In the early 70s, we have one of those little things that happen that it's almost like, well, Larry Bond has a saying I just love, that the principal difference between fiction and nonfiction is that fiction has to be plausible. I mean, what's the odds of this? So when Dave Arneson is trying to figure out how he's going to create Dungeons and Dragons with Gary Gygax, they go looking through some of the libraries to see if they can find some earlier game mechanics or some earlier examples of games. And they find the writings of Lieutenant Totten. And one of the things that Lieutenant Totten says very early in his kit of different granularities of war games is that war games need to find a way to allow anything that could happen in real life to happen in the war game. And if there is no rule that covers that happening, but it is something that could plausibly happen, then the umpire of the war game needs to use his common sense and judgment to allow it to happen. And that was taken to heart by the creators of Dungeons and Dragons and said, when we create this game, we need to make sure that that's one of the things we emphasize, that if it's something that can happen in the real world, it should be able to happen in our game. Jim Dunnigan got a lot closer to getting a war game into the military. He actually got some money. It was called Firefight. And it, according to James Dunnigan, got through several levels of approval, but it was supposed to illustrate ground combat in Germany, and it was supposed to be something that any soldier could use and simple enough and get sent around. The people that reviewed it said that these expensive new great weapons that they were buying didn't get a chance to use their range. And Dunnigan and company said, yeah, we did research into Germany, and Germany is pretty heavily forested. It has, it doesn't have a lot of huge fields. There really aren't going to be very many places there where it has the field of fire that it needs to have. And that didn't go over very well. And so commercial wargame wasn't accepted because it was too accurate. Next slide. According to Dunnigan. Okay, then you do have some one-side connections that really have some impact. And one of the things we'll be talking about is one of the problems with the connection between civilian and military wargaming is that it tends to be fleeting. That if you have somebody who played war games as a kid or believes in war games or trusts somebody that's pitching him, it will be okay, well, that guy's there, but when he leaves, it may not have the same impact. So did we skip a slide? Can we go back a slide just for a second to see? Here, okay, this must be an earlier version, never mind. Next slide. So, so Mark Herman is maybe the most famous case. He, as a teenager, worked for Jim Dunnigan in New York, later became president of Victory Games, came to work in DC for a defense contractor doing gaming for DOD, worked his way up the ranks, retired as a partner at Booz Allen Hamilton. In 1990, or rather in like 87, he did a book, a war game called Gulf Strike that included a number of different scenarios. One was an early 90s invasion by Saddam Hussein into Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which is what wound up happening. So the way Mark Herman tells the story, and I don't know if he's on the call, I might have my times a little bit off, but like at 8 o'clock, he gets a phone call to come down to the Pentagon. He gets into the building by 10. By noon, they start doing his game. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he's told that they've made enough adjustments to his game that it's not leaving the building. No, I think at 2, he was actually under contract. By like 6, he was told that the game was staying. And so actually on the day of the invasion, they were able to war game it out because all this information and all the mechanics were already there in a commercial war game. Then maybe not as momentous, but Frank Chadwick has a story he loves to tell. I think he has the letter framed in his study, but just before the ground element of the Desert Storm air-land campaign kicked off, he got a letter from this guy in at 1st Infantry Division Battalion saying that his battalion had been using one of Frank Chadwick's board games over and over and over again, practicing that battalion's mission within the overall plan for the division. And the other night there was this big windstorm and the map and the counters and the rules all blew off into the desert. And could he please send another copy that they wanted to practice some more before the offensive started. They couldn't tell him how quick they needed it, but they needed it really quick. And then in many ways, my favorite story is Marine Corps Doom. And we had at the Connections Conference, the captain and tech sergeant who made this happen. So they're saying, I did this, I did that. So we heard it firsthand. But Doom is arguably one of the very first-person shooters, if not the first, probably the second, Doom. And the tech sergeant figured out that it was just a simple flat file that subscribed that the monsters, how the monsters looked, and that you'd have flaming swords and stuff like that. And he felt that he could rewrite that so that it would be Marine Corps weapons, and the monsters would be dressed looking vaguely like terrorists or Iraqis or something. And that the Marines have this problem, and that their Marine amphibious units, the infantry go through all this training. Marines go through all this training and then physical condition, and they have this series of tests and exercise to make sure they're ready for deployment. And then they're put in these metal boxes for 6 months, and they can do chin-ups and they can run around the decks, but it's really hard to practice tactically. Well, Marine Corps, or rather the game Zoom, had an option where you could have 4 different players play together cooperatively. And the Marines had 4-man fire teams. So they would create a 4-man fire team in Doom. Well, the captain felt they needed permission, so they called up the owner of the company, and he says, "Wow, my Marine Corps wants to use my game. That's really cool. Go ahead." He said, "All right, well, can you send us a letter to that effect?" "No, I own the company. I'm telling you to do it. Don't worry about it. Just go use my game." And the Marines said, "Well, sir, we're with the government and the military and the Marines, and we need things in writing, so when we're inspected, we don't get in trouble." And he's like, all right, I'll send you something in writing. And so nothing much happens for a couple of days, and this large box shows up in their quarters, their spaces, and they open it up, and there on company letterhead is this pencil written note that says, "I, Chief President of the company, grant the U.S. Marine Corps the rights to use my game wherever they want it, for whatever they want to use it for as long as they want to use it, wherever they want to use it, signed President of the company." And underneath the single sheet of paper was 24 copies of the game. So Marine Corps Doom needed a copy of Doom that had to be bought to play. It was simply a file that would change it from monsters into enemy soldiers. And after a year or two, the Marines started doing something. It's completely unclassified now. It's in my book. At the time, though, which nations were selected was classified. But what the Marines like to say, we talk about major theater wars, but we tend to do non-emergency evacuations of embassy staffs that stay in a country longer than they really should, and then the Marines have to go save them, non-combatant evacuations. And so every Marine amphibious unit would have a Marine Corps Doom data set that would be the grounds of whichever embassy they thought was most at threat in their area of responsibility. And the lawn would be the same dimensions as the lawn of the embassy. The doors would open the same way. The stairways would be in the same location. And one of the things I thought was really clever was they would have these monsters that had 0 offensive capability, that would have tweed jackets and elbow patches and a pipe in the thing. And those would be the embassy staff that you're not supposed to shoot. So by using this, you'd inspect, you'd learn the grounds, and you'd learn what corridor goes which way, and you'd practice it, and you'd have a shoot, no shoot. Well, this was very, very popular. It was actually downloaded more times than the number of people who were assigned to the United States Marine Corps. So apparently it wasn't only Marines using this stuff. And it was so good, the Marines decided to spend the money on software that was designed by defense contractors that met all these specifications and had all this credibility. And it wasn't nearly as user-friendly and easy to use, and then it just wasn't used much anymore. So again, kind of fleeting success. A lot of the stuff that was used was in different locations. Like in the case of Annapolis, this highest class of the Navy cadets, 4th classmen, 1st classmen, whoever the seniors were, played a game for a number of years. For all I know, they're still using it, called Dark Waters. And the Annapolis faculty member who used the game came to Connections one year. And I asked him if the chief of naval operations gave you a check for $1 million to modify it, what changes would you make? He said, I wouldn't change the box art. And that has happened 2 or 3 times. But what's much more common is you have modified commercial off the shelf. For example, at our Air Command and Staff, Squadron Officer School, they were looking for a new wargame piece of software, and a piece of software that was available commercially called Modern Air Power was pretty close, but it didn't do some things they absolutely positively needed to do for it to function. So for less than twice the sightlines, just to use the war game, the designer went in and made the changes to the software that they needed. And paying someone to modify existing software is far cheaper than coming up with that software from scratch. Okay, next slide. There are also some false dawns, times when it really looked like we made a breakthrough, but the connections kind of became less with time. The first one of these was back in 1977. There was a book written about that time and articles written about that time, but Andy Marshall, who for decades was the chief of the Office of Net Assessment, invited Jim Dunnigan to this big retreat of Defense Department analysts to talk about wargaming and talk about how it could be used and all the rest. And everybody would like to say they had met Jim Dunnigan and knew him, and that was still going on when I started working at the Air Force Wargaming Center at Maxwell. But with time, it just became, there wasn't really the follow-up meetings, and the link became less pronounced. Probably one of the saddest cases was in 1997, General Krulak, a commandant of the Marine Corps, 4-star general, and the Marines don't have very many of those. They only have one commandant. He wrote a letter that reads like it was written by some advocate of commercial wargaming. He talked about how Marines realize they need to be physically fit. They also need to be mentally fit, and war games exercise the mind. He came up with a commandant's gaming list of games that Marines should play, just as they were books on the commandant's reading list, and really pushed for this a great deal. And then the general retires, and the next commandant doesn't have the same emphasis on wargaming. Of course, it's not a complete loss. The Marines had been relatively strong in wargaming before that, and continue to be very strong to this day. They're building a big facility that should have legs, that should be something that will make a difference for decades to come. But in working on my book, I talked to a fairly large number of individual Marines that would use commercial wargaming and use it to help their unit, and then they would be transferred, and then years later they'd be transferred back to the same unit. And not only were those war games not still being used, but nobody remembered that they had ever been used. So again, the commercial military links not really sticking. Next slide. Okay, one of the links that has stuck, at least for over 20 years, is the Connections Conference. And a quick war story, I want to leave time for Q&A. We did start late, but very quick. A number of you have heard this, but I don't care. It was the eve of Christmas Eve, and I was the research assistant for wargaming at the School for Advanced Air Power Studies. The Colonel Warden, the guy who came up with the Instant Thunder plan for Desert Storm, that later became Desert Storm, had just taken over as commandant of the Air Command Staff College. At the time, our school came under his school, something of a living legend. I had never met the gentleman. I had been in the room twice when he gave talks, but I was just a face in the crowd. I didn't think he could pick me out of a police lineup. Well, it's early in the afternoon, and people are already starting to leave, and I'm thinking about what emails, what tasks should I do? Do I have to do before I leave, and how early could I gracefully duck out? When the phone rings, and it's the Colonel Warden, and he starts asking me all these questions about wargaming, and his office was a couple hundred yards away, and he he was very unhappy with the state of wargaming. He felt the Instant Thunder plan was threatened because the wargame they used to review it didn't have any second order effects. That if you took out the power going to a radar, not only did the radar keep working, if you took out the radar, the anti-aircraft guns kept having the accuracy that they would need the radar to achieve. And then as he was working on the curriculum as commandant, he was wanting to change around the curriculum to show these indirect effects. And the war games being used at the school had no indirect effects, and they were very cumbersome to learn and cumbersome to play. And he wanted things that were easy to learn, easy to play, so you could focus on learning about war, not learning about the war games. And he said, is anybody doing it right? And I said, well, the Marines are doing this right, and the Navy's doing this right, and commercial wargaming is way more user-friendly, but nobody's doing everything right. And he says, well, what can we do about it? He says, well, maybe we could have a conference and so people could learn from each other. He said, okay, do it. And then he asked me another question, and I don't have time to ask or anything. So finally we get off the phone 3 hours later, and so back one slide, thank you. And I'm like, was I asked to put on a conference? And I look around and everybody has left for the day. And it's almost quitting time on a normal day. And I'm like, okay, I'm going home. And I'm like, I can't ask this living legend what he meant. I can't ask my boss to ask, because that would be like I'm trying to be asked to put on a conference. So I have this bad habit. I'm getting a little bit better. When I don't know what to do, I don't do it. And couple weeks after the new year, I'm walking down the hallway in Air Command Staff College. Colonel Warden's coming the other way. His whole face lights up. He goes up to me, he says, hey, Matt, how's the conference coming? And I'm like, oh, very well, sir. I've been giving a lot of thought. He says, oh, good. Well, I have some time now. You want to come back to my office? Says, no, let me get on your calendar. So we had the first Connections Conference just a few months later. And there's been a Connections Conference every year since 1993. And starting in 2013, it spread to the United Kingdom, and they have very large, very successful Connections conferences. Then Connections Oz, Australia, followed the next year. The year after that, Connections the Netherlands, with a very surprisingly international participation. Connections Canada followed in 17, and they put a lot of emphasis on non-combatant type of activities, phase 4, counterinsurgency, peace restoration, stuff like that. And then just a few weeks before this pandemic hit, or as it was hitting, but nobody knew it, there was the very first Connections France, and it's held concurrent with a serious game conference with a Connections type speaker, a serious game type speaker, all intermixed during the course of the conference. And then because of the pandemic, we couldn't have an in-person Connections conference this year. So we're having a global Connections the 10th through the 14th of August. And literally people from all over the world can log in and participate in this conference. We're having it fewer hours each day, so it's more conducive to different time zones. And so this is something with legs, and a big part of what Connections tries to do is try to have the commercial wargamers and the military wargamers talk to each other and learn from each other. Next slide. Okay, so back to the future. Decades ago, there was Possum Hansel, one of the leaders of the bomber offensive in World War II, was on the stage at Air Command and Staff College. And he was asked, didn't all this emphasis on bombers mean that we didn't develop fighters like we should have during the interwar period? And Hansel became enraged, and his veins stuck out on his neck, and he said, if we didn't, yeah, we emphasized bombers, we wouldn't have darkened the skies of Germany with our bombers. And then he calmed down, he says, but besides, we didn't have hardly any money to spend on fighters or on bombers. Now, is it our fault that the government decided to spend a lot of money on improving the safety and the reliability of civilian airlines? And is it our fault that that research and development had applications to bombers and military aviation altogether overall? So there's been a long-term understanding that civilian research and development is very relevant to the military, that in improvements in the civilian side, very relevant to the military. I think the time has returned that this is being understood by the military, and there's several reasons for that. One is the need for speed. When our adversary was the Soviet Union, their wargaming was really, really slow, and it was fairly easy for us to be faster. Our current adversaries are much more agile, so our wargaming has to get faster, and civilian wargames need to be faster. People don't put up with them. There's also this whole business about power to the edge, about empowering the innovators away from the headquarters buildings. And commercial wargames have to be usable by anybody, because you're not going to have somebody teaching or a contractor telling you how to use the commercial wargame. But one of the biggest reasons why you're seeing a greater acceptance is, for years and years and years, people working in military wargaming that had any type of civilian wargaming experience at all would be dismissed as, oh, those are just Dungeons and Dragons type guys and don't have those commercial wargames here. If somebody sees them, they'll think less of us. Well, now I've known of at least 2 cases where a general officer has mentioned they played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid. And when the generals have done that as children, it's kind of hard to say that all commercial wargaming should now be dismissed simply because it's commercial wargaming. So more connections, and I'm hopeful that those connections will only endure and increase in the future. I think that's my next slide. Try another one. Yep. Now the current version has the word questions there, but you don't need that on the slide. How can I, any questions I can answer? We still have some time.
Okay, so I've got 4 questions that have come up in the chat. Again, for anyone that has questions, please put them into the chat. And I've got another one coming in. So the first one is, will these slides be made available to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. We'll figure out a way to get that to everybody who would like them. Next question I have comes from another person. Was Major Livermore related to Lawrence Livermore, National Labs of the Bay Area?
You know, I've been curious about that for years, and I don't know how I can track that down. But if you can, try to get back to me with that. I have no idea. But he did go on to make full bird colonel, which in the years after the Civil War is not an easy task. It's not an easy task in any time period.
Okay, Paul, so it looks like you've got some homework there. The next question I have is, are there any war games that you would recommend that emulate the Army's operational level of war, specifically above division or at division?
Oh yeah, there've been many over the years, and I'm an air guy, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. I was a big fan for a number of years of the Next War series from GDW. It did air less bad than most games, and seemed to do ground pretty well. And then the TAC Air a number of years ago had air and land pretty much at the same level of resolution. And one of the things that I think we all kind of agree to today is that this is a joint environment. We don't fight individually. So if you are talking about ground, you need to be talking about ground and air, because neither one of us are going to show up anywhere by ourselves. But I would ask an Army guy, like the best person to ask that question to would probably be either Mike Dunn or James Sterrett out at the Army's Command and General Staff College.
Oh, okay, great. We've got another question in the chat. We've got a student looking to design or improve wargaming for the relative rapid planning of operational level. Do you have any recommendations on how that could be achieved?
Okay, well, this won't be a one-word answer.
Maybe that would be a good correspondence question.
Yeah, maybe. It's there's really two parts. One is doing the design and then getting it before an audience. And I think it's getting easier to get before an audience because there's conscious efforts now to try to reach out to industry and stuff like that. So probably if you can find a commercial publisher, either computer or print, that would be a first step, because the military is starting more than in the past, looking at what's available. You also have all the services are having these efforts to try to enhance innovation and to reach outside of the service. Just inside the Air Force Research Lab has a lot of efforts to try to make sure they just don't always go back to the same DoD contractors. As far as the design of the game itself, some of the things that would help is transparency. If it's a commercial, if it's a computer game, it can't be just a black box. People have to be able to see what's going on. If it's a print game, it again, transparent and fast to learn and fast to execute are very important. And then have it so that the people in the military can look at it and make sure the numbers are right. And if the numbers aren't right, they can change it. One of the titles that I haven't mentioned, and I should have, because it's really something of a game changer, but there's a title by Command Professional Edition out of the United Kingdom. There's a number of commercial off-the-shelf war games that have been used in military education, much less in analysis. But the Command PE, as it's called, is starting to be used more in an analytical setting. And one of the reasons it's being used that way is that the database that's available from the game is mainly Jane's. It's completely unclassified, but the game was designed in such a way you could take your classified database and run it on the same software. So one of the things we do is we have the commercial version of the game, and our young interns and young officers will play the commercial version because they're trying to figure out how to play the game and how to learn the game and how to use it. And then when we want to use it, and since it's unclassified, they can do it at home, they can do it at their desk. It's very, very convenient. And then when the time comes to use the game analytically, then we take out the unclassified database, put in the classified database, and now all these people already know how to use it. And we have to have careful controls and only use it where the room is such that it's secure for activities at that level. But we didn't have to do that when they were learning it. We only had to do it when we were using it analytically. So that's a big advantage too. I don't think I quite answered the question, but hopefully I got close. Anybody else or anything else? We got a whole minute left. Everybody, are we gone? Okay, well, if you guys can still hear me, thank you so much for this opportunity. I enjoyed the questions, and your hosts have put together quite a good program. I'm looking forward to other elements. Thank you all. Thank you, Merle.
My my internet crapped out for a moment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Internet just completely died.
Well, you're making me feel a little bit better that I'm not the only one that has tech problems.
Yeah, I've been. So I switched from being on an Ethernet cable and hardline into the system to additional things. But if you've closed the meeting, we'll go ahead and stop recording.
All righty, very good. So just click on the leave button then, right?
Yes, we do have the captain of the U.S. Army Wargaming team who would like to speak with you, though. I'm going to unmute him.
Oh, okay.
He was at least 3 or 4 of the questions that I was able to get to. And for that reason, Red, you're going to still be recorded.
Okay. Hey, sir, how's it going?
Very fine. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually it's funny you mentioned Mike Dunn and Dr. Starrett. I'm one of their students.
Ah, you're a lucky person.
I have been. Yeah, so I am. I appreciate your time because I know this is just an extra bit on top of what you already had, which was an awesome brief. I'm really excited that I got to do that. I just finished last year. I did Dr. Starrett's war game design program. So I have I devoured your textbook on wargaming, and so yeah. So the questions, in regards of operational level, and that I'm now at SAMS, and I'm looking to improve wargaming in the all domain function, which I'm sure you're more than aware of.
Oh yes.
And so I appreciate the answers that you gave me. They definitely gave me some more stuff. Dr. Starrett had mentioned the next war series, but I'll look into the TAC Air, and I myself have dipped into command a little bit, but I'll see if I can dig deeper. But I was going to see, so again, the all domain function. I'm trying to find the right direction. Like you said, I understand the transparency piece, that fast to learn, fast to execute. I'm looking at the British RCAT model that they have, and I'm trying to see a good way as you know, sir, that the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines have really good. I'm trying to figure out a good way to bring the land component to the all domain functions, operational planning. I was kind of hoping you might have I'll gladly take anything you can give me in that regard.
I wish I had something more for you.
No, that's okay. Maybe the synchronization. Is there something to that you might recommend?
Well, just it needs to be done. One of the real challenges is that, and this I should have mentioned in the main briefing. At the unclassified level, one of our potential red adversaries tends to take a very long view of war, and they tend to do war games that cover very long periods of time, very long periods of time. Now, the Soviet Union had a very granular type of wargaming, and sometimes it went fairly deep, but it would go fairly deep by taking a long, long time to wargame out. Our potential, a potential future adversary tends to look a lot deeper. One of the problems we have with wargaming all domain, including the Army, is that for very good reasons, the Army takes longer to get to the fight. I mean, you go 600 miles an hour and you get there pretty quick. The Army goes at the speed of the Ro-Ro ships and whatever else. And there's a tendency within the military that if granularity is good, more granularity is better. And granularity is the enemy of depth. In my wargaming course that I'm going to be giving again this fall, and I would love a graduate, and you're too busy with Sam's, but I'd love a graduate of Sterrett's course to come to mind to tell me, well, yeah, this part's actually better, but you need to steal this from Sterrett. But one of the things I talk about in my course is that every war game is a balance between depth, breadth, and granularity. And for a fixed length of wargaming, the sum of the depth, breadth, and granularity has to be constant. The only way for that sum not to be constant is to make the game longer. And if you're trying to turn inside a noodle loop, you can only have so much time. So I think part of getting all domain war games to do justice to the Army, the solution to that is also the solution to being able to cope with red and anticipate the consequences of what we do deeper into a campaign. And that is just biting the bullet and reducing granularity somewhat. Computers can make that bite smaller than it would be otherwise, but you're still going to have to sacrifice a certain amount of granularity. One of the things that I emphasize in wargame design is that wargame should cover the entire incident that the wargame is looking at. So if you want to wargame a dogfight, you only have to make sure it lasts 30 seconds. If you're wargaming the Normandy campaign, then you need to have your wargame last, several months. And then you should try to have your game cycle, your turn cycle, be the same as the real world decision cycle at the senior level of command that you're depicting. And so if you know how much time you have for your war game, then it needs to cover X amount of time, and you know how much time should be in each cycle. So that would tell you how many of those turns you would have to complete during the time you have available. And that kind of tells you your budget for granularity, that if you're going to need to have 20 turns during a 5-day war game, then and you have to cover X amount of time, then each one of those cycles have to be able to be executed within the prescribed time. And that kind of gives you a target to aim for in figuring out how much granularity you can afford to have in your game. And the same trade-offs, the same approach that would allow the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps to be depicted more fully in multi-domain war games will be the same actions that would let all of us see deep enough into campaigns in order to not be surprised by our adversary, because things may look to go like they're going well during the period of time that we war game, but then surprise, surprise, beyond the end of our war game, things start going south because of all the logistics and everything else.
Yes, sir.
And in the book, I'm sure you read about Operation Otto, where the German war game of the invasion of Soviet Union is pretty close to what happens up to the end of the war game, which ended in November 15th. But after November 15th, things changed quite a bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah. No, that's great, sir. That's awesome. Man, and that's great, sir. I really appreciate your time. I think you'd be excited to see some of, so like was mentioned, I'm the the team captain for, specifically we've been doing Warhammer 40K. That's
Okay.
that for U.S. Army esports. So we're a group of we're soldiers all across the Army that we're the team I recruited under me, the other players that were across the United States, so we can get to all the events. We're not like the rest of the esports team. They've got the convenience of they just jump on their computer wherever they're at and play a game. We've got to actually get to the physical locations to play on the tabletop. But it's been pretty awesome. I've been extremely privileged to be the team captain to lead those guys through it in the meantime. It's kind of a additional duty detail that I've got, but it's
That sounds
awesome.
great. That sounds great.
It
Well,
is.
if you could help me out in a way that I think is going to be just a terrible hardship on your part. But I am doing the second edition of the book that Larry Bond is going to publish it. And this time I am going to get royalties. But I don't want to just reprint the same book. So there's probably things that I missed, particularly in the case of the Army, but anywhere. If you could send me, and my email address is, my home email address is all one word, Matthew B. Caffrey Jr. So MatthewBCaffreyJr@gmail.com. If you have anything about how, the Indians war game, or the Brazilians war game, or new innovations out of the U.S. Army that were too recent to get into the book. It was published in 19, but it took them like 32 months from when I turned in the manuscript to when it was published. So I'm sure the Army has come up with some new and innovative wargaming since like 2016. Anything you could send me, I'd very much appreciate.
Sure. Yes, sir. Yeah. No, and I'll, if you don't mind, I'll double check with Dr. Starrett before I send anything your way, if you're okay with
Sure.
that.
That's great. No, that'll only make it better.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. That's great, sir. Again, I really appreciate your time and you taking the time to talk to me. It has definitely helped keep me going with the momentum that I've got already. So
Excellent. Excellent.
Awesome.
I appreciate what you're doing. War games save lives, and they only save lives if we war game better than our adversaries. And it was
That's right,
really
sir.
easy to do that in the case of the Soviets. It's not as easy anymore.
It's not. No, yeah. And that's, when we talk all domain, just as you're aware, I mean, trying to include the information, the cyber, the space and everything, it takes it to another level for sure.
Yep. All right, very good. Well, good meeting you. Hopefully I'll meet you again sometime in person.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I look forward to that opportunity.
And we're 3 speakers away from having the agenda finished for the Connections Conference. And this year it's free as it has been for years. And this year you can jump onto one talk, miss the next, jump onto the one after that. So really review the agenda. I'd be surprised if there aren't at least a dozen of the talks that you'd find useful.
Yeah, I saw the link. I'm after this conversation, I'm going to register. I look forward to it.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you much. I hope to
Awesome,
see
sir.
you again. Very
Yep,
good.
take care.
Good night.
All right. Well, with that, we will conclude the recording. So have a good night, guys.
All righty.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.